Hi and welcome. This is Romans 9:18, and welcome to Herman Bavinck's Generous Theology. Welcome again. For this episode, we're going to take a look and follow up on a previous topic. We're going to look at the Enlightenment and how secular figures present it today. So previously we talked about Steven Pinker. We will revisit his work, Enlightenment Now, and just take a brief look at some of the things that he thinks are very valuable. And so we will start here with a quote from his work. He says, "If there's anything the Enlightenment thinkers had in common, it was an insistence that we energetically apply the standard of reason to understanding our world, and not fall back on generators of delusion like faith, dogma, revelation, authority, charisma, mysticism, divination, visions, gut feelings, or the hermeneutic parsing of sacred texts." And so we'll see where Pinker wants to go with this. Next slide. And so he proposes 4 central topics that he thinks represents the best of the Enlightenment: reason, science, humanism, and progress. Of course, from my point of view, there's nothing particularly controversial about 3 of these 4. Of course, I do reject his humanism, but what is so trying about this presumption is the idea that one side or the other owns these items, and that the other side must somehow be anti or contra or against those things. Next slide. And so Pinker gives us a characterization that he opposes, and it is presented in the light of this educated Englishman of 1600. And this Englishman represents everything that Pinker is against or would reject. He says, "The scientific revolution was revolutionary in a way that is hard to appreciate today, now that its discoveries have become second nature to most of us. The historian David Wooten reminds us of the understanding of an educated Englishman on the eve of the revolution in 1600. Next slide. This educated Englishman believes witches can summon up storms that sink ships at sea. He believes in werewolves. He believes Circe really did turn Odysseus's crew into pigs. He believes mice are spontaneously generated in piles of straw. He believes in contemporary magicians. He believes that a murdered body will bleed in the presence of the murderer." Next slide. He believes that there is an ointment which, if rubbed on a dagger which has caused a wound, will cure that wound. He believes that the shape, color, and texture of a plant gives a clue to how it will work as a medicine, because God designed nature to be interpreted by mankind. He believes that it is possible to turn base metal into gold, although he doubts that anyone knows how to do it. He believes that nature abhors a vacuum. He believes the rainbow is a sign from God, and that comets portend evil. He believes that dreams predict the future if we know how to interpret them. He believes, of course, that the earth stands still and the sun and stars turn around the earth once every 24 hours. Next slide. And so these clues, these characterizations create Pinker's opposition, and Pinker's educated Englishman of 1600 that he cites here has the honor of standing in for what religious believers, and of course anyone else who opposes his ideas of enlightenment, hold to be true in 2020. I bet you can't see that straw man coming. Next slide. So let's take a moment and notice in this characterization that Pinker actually seems to be making a classic mistake that one would not expect from a highly educated, enlightened thinker. Now, in this characterization, Wooten and Pinker do not specifically cite the idea of a flat earth or attribute that idea to this particular Englishman. But the other superstitious beliefs and geocentric ideas, of course, are present. And so who hasn't heard of the myth of the flat earth? And so we can see the idea popularized. Next slide. But the truth is that this myth of flat earth, which sort of seems to represent in one specific example all of the kinds of foibles that Enlightenment thinkers like Pinker want to paint their opponents in. But it seems like these kinds of beliefs were not nearly so well as established as Pinker would like to say. So, for example, the classic mischaracterization is this belief in a flat earth. And so the Enlightenment characterization, of course, is that we know better now. But the truth is, we have evidence to think that this belief in a flat earth was never the commonplace belief that Pinker and the enlightened Brights would have us think. Next slide. There never was a period of flat earth among scholars in the Middle Ages, regardless of how the public at large may have conceptualized our planet, both then and now. Knowledge of the spherical nature of the earth never faded from the Greek knowledge we had in antiquity, and all major medieval scholars accepted the roundness of the earth as an established fact of cosmology. Next slide. And so, while not specifically advocating for the flat earth, Pinker's representative Englishman does seem to be a caricature and a straw man from the very beginning. How is that helpful to characterize one's opponents in such an opportunistic way? Next slide. There is, in fact, a long series of people who have used such a conflict and attempted to weaponize one's opposition by painting them in a historically inaccurate way. And so Wooten and Pinker's caricature, as well as the flat earth myth, represents two examples of what's called a conflict thesis, a historical approach to the history of science that originated during the Enlightenment era, the 19th century. And this thesis maintains that there is an intrinsic intellectual conflict between religion and science that inevitably leads to hostility. Next slide. What's the cold, hard truth? Well, historians of science have long ago rejected the thesis that there is such a conflict and have instead widely accepted a complexity thesis. Nonetheless, the thesis remains strong elsewhere, not least in the popular mind. And as we can see here, even Enlightenment Brights like Steven Pinker can make the mistake. Next slide. And so, perhaps in addition to Pinker's four themes, the case for reason, science, humanism, and progress, perhaps we could augment and add one more to the list, demagogy. But after rejecting Christianity's supernaturalism, Enlightenment naturalists often smuggle supernatural principles right back in. And so where does Enlightenment lead us? Where can reason, science, humanism, and progress take us to? Well, let's look at this tweet from the crypto-naturalist, who says, "The universe is an ongoing explosion. That's where you live, in an explosion. We absolutely don't know what living is. Sometimes atoms just get very haunted. That's us. When an explosion explodes hard enough, dust wakes up and thinks about itself and tweets about it. This is the case that reason, science, humanism, and progress leads us to. I'm not so impressed." We just spoke of a conflict thesis and the example in a current contemporary work by Steven Pinker, in which one of the properties of the Enlightenment thought is to demonize and demagogue the opposition. And so to use a conflict thesis to presuppose an incompatibility, for example, between traditional modes of thought and Enlightenment ideals such as reason and progress. And so one example of a casualty of this sort of filtering, this kind of demagogy and cavalier dismissal of interesting and relevant topics. One casualty is Leibniz's argument from contingency, a powerful philosophical argument for the existence of a personal, non-material first mover, which is implied by the presupposed existence of a causal order. And so the argument starts by asking the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Next slide. Leibniz pondered the matter and concluded that the answer is to be found not in a universe of created things, but in God. God exists necessarily, Leibniz thought, and he is the explanation why anything else exists. Next slide. And so we have 3 steps or premises in Leibniz's reasoning. And here we'll give a short summary of the argument that is incomplete for now, but we will complete it soon enough. Premise number 1, everything that exists has an explanation of its existence. Premise 2, if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. And then 3, the universe exists. Is this a reasonable argument? Next slide. Well, let's start with the first statement in the argument. Everything that exists has an explanation of its existence. And this statement presupposes the existence of a causal order. That is, the idea that all events in the universe are causally determined. That is, a causal purpose links each and every event. Next slide. And so let's take a look then at the first statement. Everything that exists has an explanation of its existence. This is, of course, granted by most Enlightenment thinkers, since if the statement were false, it would imply that some things exist without an explanation, without a cause. In other words, it would be okay in such a world to think that things could spontaneously pop into existence without any explanation. For example, who then could object to a supernatural idea of the miraculous if things did not require an explanation for their existence? So, for example, why is there a turtle on the post? An adequate answer under such conditions might be that the turtle just popped into existence on the post. Next slide. Of course, thinking about this premise, Leibniz realized that an objection could be made, for example, by an atheist. If all things have an explanation for their existence, then what caused God? And we have a quote here from Carl Sagan. Where did God come from? If we decide this is an unanswerable question, why not save a step and conclude that the origin of the universe is an unanswerable question? Next slide. The general problem with statement 1 is that a naive statement of it, like we have said, which goes like this: everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, leaves no room for a termination of the causal order. When do we stop explaining? When have we reached a resting condition for our explanation? Therefore, Leibniz modified the first statement, and it is this mature statement that is the actual argument he is making. And it goes, everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. Now here, Leibniz maintains the existence of a causal order, but he distinguishes that while some things exist contingently, that is, they find their explanation in some other earlier thing or event, yet some things exist necessarily, that is, by the logical necessity of their own nature. They do not have a cause, but exist eternally, independent of a causal relationship with other things. Next slide. So here is the updated argument from Leibniz. Everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. 2. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. 3. The universe exists. Next slide. And so from these three premises, Leibniz argues and concludes, 4. The universe has an explanation of its existence. And 5. Therefore, the explanation of the universe's existence is God. Next slide. And so, taking the argument at its face value, we can see that philosophically, Leibniz has offered a relevant and intriguing answer to a fundamental question. And yet, in the non-dogmatic Enlightenment, such arguments are frowned upon as smacking of dogmatism and are to be not even considered because of their obvious religious content. But if the supernatural is indeed part of the universe, then why aren't such arguments considered? Why aren't they legitimate arguments to bring forward and make? Thank you, Gottfried Leibniz. And so we have found that a key tenet from early Enlightenment thinkers, such as Schleiermacher, the early Schlegel, and others, in which the supernatural was excluded from consideration in the search for answers, in trying to find answers to ultimate questions about reality. We can see that our Enlightenment thinking friends have made a mistake. And this article actually here provides an interesting insight as to why that might be. Now, the article is entitled Brain Gain. A person can instantly blossom into a savant, and no one knows why. Now, the suggestion here is not that the phenomenon referenced in this article must be a demonstration of the supernatural. Rather, the thesis here is that we're about to talk about a phenomenon with an objective appearance, with people who actually fit this pattern. And yet, because of this Enlightenment tendency to reject a supernatural explanation, we have an example of a situation where supernaturalism could very well be a legitimate explanation. And so the pruning of the supernatural from reality seems very premature on the part of Enlightenment thinkers. So let's take a look at the condition here. In sudden savant syndrome, an ordinary person with no prior interest or ability often has an unanticipated or spontaneous epiphany-like moment that changes them, and where gifts of insight into music or art or mathematics are experienced and revealed. And there's no underlying disability that corresponds to this. This syndrome, called sudden savant syndrome, would be better termed as sudden genius. Next slide. And so this article cites a researcher who has taken a look at 14 cases, documented cases, where someone has spontaneously developed some limited form of genius without any obvious associated causal factors. So, for example, some people go from little or no music experience to almost instantly becoming talented musicians, playing at a professional level, yet without the corresponding years of study. Other people may develop mathematical intuitions without training, or artistic tendencies, or just heightened abilities in some area of life. But why? Next slide. In some of these cases, the extraordinary ability surfaces in early childhood. And in other cases, there can be an associated trauma, such as a head injury, or a stroke, or some other central nervous system incident. Next slide. In this article, I saw a very insightful quote that said, "The line between profound talent and profound disability seems to be a surprisingly thin one. What is the explanation for this phenomenon?" Today, there is no scientific or phenomenal explanation. And so now one has to ask, what about the supernatural? If we have no scientific explanation, and yet we have evidence of this sudden genius syndrome, why not look to the noumenal aspects of reality, the supra-scientific, for explanations? In some sense, the existence of spontaneous, sudden genius might very well be evidence for the existence of God. Next slide. I'm reminded of amazing abilities being documented in the texts of the Holy Scriptures. It's not perfectly clear if this is such an example, but in 1 Kings chapter 7, we read that King Solomon sent to Tyre and brought Huram, whose mother was a widow from the tribe of Naphtali, and whose father was from Tyre, and was a skilled craftsman in bronze. Huram was filled with wisdom, with understanding, and with knowledge to do all kinds of bronze work. He came to King Solomon and did all the work assigned to him. He cast 2 bronze pillars. He also made 2 capitals of cast bronze, as well as a network of interwoven chains, and on the list goes. Of course, the text isn't completely conclusive. Perhaps Huram learned his trade from his father, who was a skilled bronze craftsman. Yet the text gives us this sense, this idea, that Huram was filled with wisdom, something that seems so unusual that the king would send for this very special person. Is this an example of sudden genius syndrome? And is it evidence of the supernatural? Well, to date, we certainly don't have a scientific explanation. Will we have a scientific explanation in the future? Hard to say. But the key here is to note how the Enlightenment Brights will look for a scientific explanation to the exclusion of something supernatural or noumenal. Next slide. And so there may be other situations like this where we have questions about reality that are ultimately beyond what logic, reason, and inductive methods such as science are able to prove. And since these answers are beyond science, how can they be tested to establish that one explanation is better than another? Well, the answer, of course, is that being supra-scientific, these phenomena cannot be scientifically evaluated. This is precisely the danger that Kant considered, Enlightenment bright that he was, when he partitioned reality in terms of the noumenal and the phenomenal. Here's the point. One ignores the noumenal in the search for explanation at their peril. For Herman Bavinck's Generous Theology, this is Romans 9:18.